There she is. So welcome to this De Morgan Foundation talk on the De Morgans and Italy, how the light and art of Italy inspired the couple's life and their own artwork. So in today's talk, I'll be going through sort of starting with this image, a key image really, of the De Morgans leaving Italy for the last time. And we'll talk a little bit about what the reasoning behind that might have been and what that meant to them. And then we'll look a little bit more at their life in Italy. So what inspired them to go there in the first place, and how they sort of lived there, a little bit of an insight into their personal life, and what they were up to. And of course, the art that they made will particularly come through as we go through the talk today. So I hope everybody enjoys it. So this image, we think, was taken in 1914 as a letter written by William de Morgan that exists only as a transcript in his sister-in-law's biography of the two de Morgans, titled William de Morgan and His Wife, reads as follows. "We have left Florence for good. My wife's pictures have almost all arrived here and will live in a big studio nearby with no one to look at. We went for a fortnight to Venice, the most delicious place in the world." And so it's interesting to sort of think of the De Morgans in this context of the sort of the sheer sadness, I suppose, of the occasion of them leaving Italy, knowing that would be for the last time, even though they'd lived there in the winters for 24 years by 1914, since 1890. But as far as I'm aware, this is the only photograph taken of the two of them in Italy. So a real sort of one full of huge emotions as they're visiting Venice, I think, together for the first time, even though they've been to Italy many times before. And so seeing that really wonderful and beautiful place, but also filled with the sort of sadness of having to leave. So why then would they do that when Italy had clearly, as we'll see, been a place of such enormous inspiration to both of them? Well, in also 1914, William de Morgan wrote to one of his friends, a Professor Phelps, that Florence had grown too melancholy to live in. And indeed, by this time, Italian politics were in something of a state of turmoil. In 1911, Giolotti's government had agreed to send forces to occupy Libya, getting Italy involved in a war on the Ottoman Empire, which held Libya as a colony. So the war had ended only a year later in 1912, but the occupation resulted in acts of extreme discrimination towards Libyans, and such as the forces' deportations of Libyans to the Trinity Islands in October 1911, and by 1912 a third of these refugees had died due to a lack of food supplies and shelter from the Italian forces. And as we know, the De Morgans were liberal artists. They really did believe in this idea of the greater good and doing right by humankind, and I can really see that such unrest in a country that they'd held home and sort of holding them accountable for these political activities would have really affected them and maybe caused something of that melancholy. At the same time, the expansion of the electorate from 3 million to 8.5 million voters in 1912, which was the change in the law about who could vote, had sort of brought with it gains for the socialist and Catholic forces. But despite that, the quite liberal Prime Minister Giolotti lost his once powerful hold on the press and eventually resigned from his position in 1914, early 1914, which led to a change in leadership. And it was the start, really, of the more sort of conservative government coming in place in Italy. And leading really to the starting of these kind of fascist ideals beginning under the conservative Antonio Salandra. So again, knowing what we know of the De Morgans as being very liberally minded, very fair people and artists, this sort of unrest that was beginning to develop in Italy was perhaps a reason for them leaving. In Florence, so the city that they'd called home more specifically. This was, of course, a medieval citadel, and you do see a sense of that in the image we're looking at, which is a postcard of a photograph taken of the city in 1914. And this city was originally built in medieval times on the fortunes of cloth merchants and of moneylenders, but had grown to be the capital of Italy in the 19th century. But following the unification of Italy, when Rome became the capital, Florence had boomed, with a population doubling throughout the 19th century to some 450,000. So it had become quite a bustling town. And again, maybe this had sort of ruined some of the magic for the De Morgans, who of course were there to visit the great galleries such as the Uffizi and be inspired by some of the Renaissance art that they associated with that medievalism in the city. 1908 had also seen the deaths of artists such as Harriet Hosmer and John Rodham Spencer Stanhope, both of whom had moved to Italy, Harriet Hosmer to Rome and Spencer Stanhope to Florence, in order to create homes and studios there. The artists in the late 19th century would visit with some regularity, as we'll see, and perhaps this sort of decline of the old set and some of the friends and family that they knew in the area moving away also have made Florence a sort of melancholic place for the De Morgans to visit, and perhaps been a reason for their leaving. So why go in the first place then, if it's become this melancholy place? Well, of course, it wasn't always for the De Morgans. I don't have any evidence and can't find any that William De Morgan visited Italy prior to meeting his wife Evelyn in 1884 and following their marriage in 1887. Particularly, we know that they visited together quite a lot, but whether he visited ever without her is a bit of an unknown. So the story of the De Morgans being in Italy, particularly biographically, really does start with Evelyn when she was Evelyn Pickering, an aspiring artist in the 1870s. And quite early in her life and career as an artist, when she was just 17 years old, her maternal uncle, John Rodham Spencer Stanhope, we've just mentioned, took out a lease on the Villa Niti in Bellascardo, which is the town that we're looking at in the photograph here, a modern day photograph of this town. It doesn't look any different, as you'll come to see. And this is in the foothills surrounding Florence. He decided to move here to sort of a warmer environment on the advice of his doctor, owing to the really terrible asthma that he suffered. This had caused him to move twice previously, once to an address called Hill House. So being on the higher level was indeed also thought to be very good for the lungs and for asthma in the Victorian period, and eventually to a house designed by Philip Webb in Surrey. With his wife, someone called Elizabeth King, or Lilla, as she was known to the family. So the two of them moved out to Florence in 1873 on a lease with Villa Niti, which he would go on to buy by the 1880s and live there until his death in 1908. Another driving factor in deciding to move there permanently by 1880 was perhaps that very sadly, Lilla and Rodham's daughter had passed away, and she was actually buried at the English cemetery in Florence. So maybe it was that sort of wanting to have that connection to their young daughter who passed away after the burial had taken place in Florence. Of course, that's a bit chicken and egg. Did they bury her there and want to leave something of themselves there permanently because they knew they were going to move there? But either way, that's what happened around that time. It soon became a must-see location for artists. John Rodham Spencer Stanhope by the 1870s was particularly well known as this sort of late pre-Raphaelite artist, very interested in the redevelopment of tempera art and sort of using plaster and trying to recreate the texture of frescoes, which he'd seen in Italy. But before that, he'd been a pupil to the great British artist George Frederick Watt, and worked quite for some time on the Oxford murals at the Oxford Union, debating ceilings with the pre-Raphaelite artists, who was very well known to them, and a particular friend of Edward Burne-Jones, who was one of the first artists to visit Villa Niti as early as 1873, when he first took that lease out on it. It wasn't long before the young Evelyn De Morgan came to visit as well, and we've got it well documented that she went on a tour of Italy, we'd think on her own, showing what a sort of incredible young woman she was. at the age of just 20 years old, to be able to travel unchaperoned on her own around Italy is quite impressive for a young woman at that time. And a sketchbook in a private collection has recently come to my attention. Very recently, I managed to see it for the first time 2 days ago. So this talk's been put together a little bit on the knowledge that I was going to be seeing that. And here we have some of those sketches from the book, which are incredible to see and really do document the artist travelling alone through Italy and her want to capture lots of information at once. And she chose to do this in watercolours. I believe this to be due to the new technology of watercolours becoming available. They would be sold through merchants such as Winsor & Newton and Robeson, so the artist makers, paint makers, in dry pellets or cakes, very similar to how they're available now if anyone is a watercolourist or has ever used watercolours. But that meant that they could be put in a neat little box with a brush in a jam jar of water, and you could go off and travel a little bit easier than taking oils on plein air. So it seems to be watercolours that the young Evelyn de Morgan preferred. And the reason for showing you this image, of course, is I said it hadn't changed much. It is from a slightly different angle to the photograph, but that's quite clearly the town of Bellascardo, which makes us sort of be able to understand that she was interested in taking actual drawings of the Italian landscape, reminding herself of the places she visited, but that the house and the area that her uncle had moved to was of particular importance to that young artist. So these have been fascinating to see. A more developed drawing and image in the sketchbook, which is on the right-hand side by Evelyn de Morgan, shows her approach to starting to put together these townscapes, very influenced by the look and the aesthetic of the Italian towns and cities that she would have seen and that she would have been visiting. And on the left, we have a much more worked up, finished picture that's in a range of materials, sort of a thicker body colour in a gouache paint and oil, and that's in the collection of Whitwick Manor in Wolverhampton. But you can see from this very detailed watercolour sketch through to final picture that de Morgan really was interested in keeping hold of these sketches and having them appear, or elements of them appear, in her final paintings to give that real Italian sort of look and aesthetic to her pictures. What's particularly interesting about these two images is that sketch predates final painting by about 20 years. And that's actually something quite common that we know from de Morgan's practice, is that she would come up with compositional forms, ideas, keep notes and references in her sketchbook, and then add those much later into her paintings. And that's again true in another example from the private sketchbook. Here we have some lovely rooftops that have been painted in quite a lot of detail obviously whilst on the move, whilst travelling around. Unfortunately, the location of the sketch on the left hasn't been noted down, so I can't tell you exactly where that is. But I really love that it's clearly been taken from somewhere higher up, so inside a building perhaps, rather than in the town, giving the artist a different viewpoint once again of these towns and cities that she was studying. And I think that really shows what a thorough artist she was, particularly in this period where she's trying to capture elements from life in order to translate them into some of her pictures. But draw from life she exactly has done, faithfully replicating each detail, such as the shadows of the roofs, the green in the shutters, and even some of the washing hanging out of the window. So even though they're not studies of people, which we also know she made in great numbers, the hint of life being there and this being a lived-in place also comes through in these very quick sketches, which I think is a wonderful, very astute thing to be able to capture, that sort of glimmer of human activity within very sort of otherwise sort of cold stone buildings. It's incredibly clever. On the right-hand side, we have a bit of a giveaway here, as this is clearly a scene from Venice. Instead of a street going through the middle of the very tall buildings that she's captured, we have water, so a bit of a giveaway there. But it's quite interesting to me that the more detailed of these studies that are I think definitely from Venice, actually it's the ones with these, that she puts herself again on a completely different vista. She's probably on a gondola or on a balcony of a building looking out into the canal with the buildings coming above her. So she's really understanding that her position can change the communication of the places that she's been to in these tiny sketches. She hasn't just gone and sat on St. Mark's Square and drawn and painted the big recognizable Duomos. She's not painting people on gondolas to give an impression of what being in Venice is like. Her reasons for being there seem to be something quite different to other artists. She's not there to make souvenirs and capture things for other people to have as keepsakes. It's a real experimentation with how the light falls on the buildings, what the reflections of water can do, how human life can affect the feel navigation of her later paintings. And like I've said, how different viewpoints and putting herself within the cities can really change how she communicates those places to us. So even though they are just tiny watercolour sketches, I think we really get a sense of her wanting to have this thorough understanding of the places that she was sketching. In amongst these, the sketchbook of these beautiful Italian vistas was a compositional piece. And it was a brilliant moment when I saw this, because even from these very simple pencil lines, I could match this to being a compositional study for a painting, again made much later. So we think the sketches are all from 1875, whereas this painting is 1897. So 22 years it took her to realise this idea from composition through to the final painting. And I just love that at the same time she was making picking out the elements of buildings and looking at these geometric structures. Her reasons for doing that were probably to build them up into a painting, which has, of course, this much softer foreground of the draperies and the human bodies in her later picture. Now, Blindness and Cupidity, Chasing Joy from the City, is a painting which focuses on our spiritual blindness and our greed, cupidity meaning greed, and you see the figure there holding all of these treasures in his arms, unable to see that what he's actually doing is chasing any hope of spiritual reconciliation away and out of these city walls. But the fact she set it within an Italian city has, you know, sort of always been something I've been interested in. And I think seeing that the composition is in with all of these sketches and studies of buildings really starts to show us why this painting in particular has those images. She was clearly thinking about how to depict those two things at a similar time, and therefore one has directly influenced the other. I think the arrangement of the buildings in this is really quite astounding. This predates the Cubists by some 10, 15 years, and yet the arrangement of those buildings sort of almost tumbling down the hill, or as we know from her sketches, have all been sort of added into that background, even though they're taken from completely different angles, almost making this impossible background to the painting. They really remind me of the later paintings of Georges Braque, the Cubist painter, and some of Cézanne paintings of farmhouses in the French hills, in the provincial hills. So I think that there's a lot to be said for how she interpreted buildings and how she wanted to put those into her paintings, and then what came after. So maybe not a direct influence to the Cubists, but it's interesting to think of some of her sort of turn of the century paintings like this one as something that predates those much later, much more abstract pictures. So it was a really exciting find in the sketchbook. Now, other sketches taken by the artist from around this time are sort of show other elements of what she was up to when she was in Italy. And it wasn't just drawing and painting from these primary sources and from life, from the buildings and the streets that she was visiting, that she was walking around and physically being in. She was also looking at paintings done by other people, and in no particular order, some of the artists that she would have seen at the Uffizi Gallery in Florence when she was visiting there are the work of Mantegna. Spelling mistake on that slide, I do apologise about that. It's me trying to type too quickly. But we have again a watercolour study of the arrangement of the three wise men in this nativity scene by Mantegna, and you can just about make them out here on the central panel, so the centre of the central panel with the nativity taking place just here in the bottom right hand corner. So this starts to give us an idea of which reference points to Renaissance painting De Morgan was making. And I think Mantegna became a really important artist for her, not just from this nativity triptych that she'd seen in the Uffizi and quite clearly been interested enough in to capture that the arrangement of figures and some of the colours that she did in that picture, but also for her to look at some of Mantegna's other work. And I think that has a real influence on some of her later drawings, particularly to my mind, this picture, which is called The Valley of the Shadows. It's made in quite an unusual medium, that being a chalk pastel to give us this beautiful red, and charcoal to give us the darker tones throughout this piece. But then in a pigment of her own creation, which she made using something called a cake of gold. So again, one of these very dry pellets of a gold pigment that she made up into all sorts of different materials, such as a thin body colour, which we see her using in the rays of light. But also, I think she made it up into her own crayon type material using a gum arabic. And we can see where that's been sort of burnished in to make the trees and some of the dresses and drapery in this painting. This shows her sort of technical side of this artist. We've already seen her using watercolour and responding to oil painting. And in looking at this artwork, we see how she responds to the work of Mantegna, I think, by using this sort of amazing pigment of her own creation. And whilst we can't see a direct visual link, perhaps maybe in the arrangement of some of the figures and sort of these figures being held in these rocky sort of outcrops rather than in an interior or in any other sort of landscape. But particularly to my mind, it's this painting by Mantegna, which De Morgan would have known from the National Gallery in London collection of the Cult of Sybil. And in it, you can see that Mantegna has, rather than giving a realistic depiction of a scene, he's actually made it look as though it's from carved marble and stone, which is an amazing approach to creating a painting, to try and make it look as though it's carved from other materials. What the scene the painting depicts is the introduction of the goddess Sybil to the city of Rome. In the far left, we see the goddess represented by the spherical stone on the litter. And according to the Roman writer Juvenal, she fell to earth as a meteor. And so what Mantegna has done is translate some of that into using the stone to represent the figures. He'd actually planned 4 other canvases for this, and they were supposed to be given to the ancient Roman Cornelia family as sort of freestyle paintings to decorate their apartments. And I just think that there is possibly something in the aesthetic and the look of this picture, which De Morgan has maybe picked up on in her painting, or in this case, the drawing. She also made an oil on canvas version of this. But certainly in the arrangement of the figures, how they're clustered together, I think we get a lot of sense of Mantegna coming through. So even as well as the country, Italy influenced her, certainly with Italian Renaissance painters did. And here we have just another example of that same idea. So we have a sketch done in watercolour, again by De Morgan, as a copy of the Baptism of Christ by Verrocchio. And in the next slide, we see the original of that. So I think we start to see, now we've looked at a couple of examples of these, that what De Morgan's doing is not trying to make a realistic copy. They're definitely not things to sell. They're sort of notes to herself in a painterly form of the colours and the impression and the stances that she's seen in these figures. So sort of it's almost like a note to self, but made pictorially, of different ideas that she might want to capture. And I think particularly arrangements of figures is something that she's quite keen on. We know from her time as a student at the Slade School of Arts that she was very keen on composition and actually won prizes for her work in composition. So I think arrangement of people is definitely something that was particularly important to her. And we see her start to replicate this aesthetic, particularly from the Verrocchio paintings in some of her works, such as the Salutation, made in 1883. So a really tender moment when the mother of Christ meets the mother of John the Baptist, and both of them realise in that moment that they're both pregnant. So we have the wonderfully sort of symbolic picture of the lilies in the background. But again, the buildings and the structure of the painting really speak to those sketches that she was making in Italy, but also the kind of cropped, sort of craggy landscapes are directly relatable to some of the Italian Renaissance masters that she was looking at during her formative years in Italy as well. Verrocchio continued to be a real influence in the work of De Morgan. In one of her very earliest paintings, which she actually completed in Italy in 1875, called Tobias and the Angel. And here we have that painting on the right-hand side, and a drawing of a fish in a net, which had been made in watercolour by Evelyn de Morgan. Again, one of these sketches that she's making in Italy. So it makes me wonder what other activities she got up to there, and whether she went to a fish market and asked for a trout to be sort of strung up in a particular way, because the density of the body of that fish and the sort of arrangement of the scales mean it's definitely been drawn from life in watercolour again, before it was added as an element in her painting. This sort of connection between De Morgan's painting, Tobias and the Angel, which we're looking at here, has been really picked up on and explored by an art historian called Jan Marsh in a forthcoming publication, which is due in 2022, in this year, happily, which assesses the De Morgan's lives. And she's particularly looked at this 1875 visit which De Morgan made to Italy, to Rome, Perugia and Assisi, and to how sort of she had different influences on her, which contributed towards the making of this painting, Tobias and the Angel. Excuse me. She cites this image by Verrocchio, with the boy and the Archangel Raphael striding together with this wonderful billowing drapery as one of the pieces which could have been an influence, but also looks at a slightly lesser known triptych by Perugino in the National Gallery. So again, an Italian Renaissance figure which could absolutely be influencing De Morgan's work. So it's really interesting to sort of unpick those visual elements in the paintings, which we can do sort of aside from De Morgan's biography, but to know that she was interested in those paintings is really something. And of course, I had to include Botticelli in there, even though this is sort of well-trodden ground and links between De Morgan and Botticelli are well understood. Here we have probably gouache rather than watercolour copy of The Birth of Venus by a young De Morgan, probably taken in the Uffizi Gallery. Even though this one's a bit more detailed and developed and worked up than some of the other pieces that we've looked at, I still think it was one that was done quite quickly and probably in situ, owing to the sort of quite naive, crude capturing of this glorious painting. As you'll see, De Morgan's only chosen to focus on this section of the painting with the two female figures, rather than include the figures of Zephyr and the winds in the painting, who were of course blowing Venus to shore as she was born from the sea foam, according to the classical mythology. And instead she's sort of really focusing in on the fabrics worn by the figure of Springtime or Primavera, who's coming running towards Venus to cloak her. And it's those fabrics I think that De Morgan was most interested in capturing, due to this painting, Flora, from 1894, in which we can absolutely see that the elements of the garments worn by the figure of Flora are absolutely relatable to Botticelli's painting, with that red shawl over that beautiful golden glowing gown. So again, a direct reference there to some of the visual elements in the paintings. Dr. Melissa Gustin, who's a great friend of the De Morgan collection, gave a brilliant talk last week and is developing a paper on the moment on Evelyn de Morgan's use of Medusa, particularly in her sculpture. A sculpture we know very little about, but as Melissa pointed out last week, we can see that this bronze was probably made on that first trip to Italy, so a very productive time for such a young artist. And she believes that this was could possibly have been made in a foundry in Rome on the occasion of her visiting Harriet Hosman, who made a Medusa marble. Hosman was a particularly well-established artist in Italy at this time, and visiting her studio was sort of a must-do in the guidebooks. And so it's interesting to see that De Morgan stepped out of her comfort zone of painting, made one of her very rare sculptures, again, due to that direct influence of what was going on in Italy in her formative years. So we have something that looks very different, I think, in the context of talking about the De Morgans in Italy. Probably not a painting for anyone very familiar with this artist's work that you would have been expecting to see. But I think it speaks to the length of time the De Morgans spent in Florence and how Evelyn particularly her career developed over time. And there is something about going abroad, even for any of us, that you get somewhere and you can sense that the light is different to how it is at home. And I think particularly when we're thinking of Victorian London and the smoke-filled, smog-filled streets that the De Morgans would have lived in, compared to the sort of glorious sunsets of Florence, I think there definitely is something in the fact that that Evelyn in particular was influenced by the light in order to create a body of work in the later years of her life, which absolutely focused on light as one of the key subjects. And I've particularly picked out moonbeams due to an excerpt in a letter that was written from Florence in 1893 by Evelyn de Morgan to one of her and William's friends, Emily Russell Barrington. And it almost reads like a diary entry that she's put together in a letter, one of the few surviving letters by the artist. And it reads, "We have tea and an egg early before 8, and then go to the studios, which is 2 doors off, back again at 12 for lunch, then back to the studios until the light goes, which it does soon, on or about 4. We then turn onto the Magnoni, where it is fine. There is a glorious sunset going on, and if it is raining, it looks like Wales. Then we have tea and go for a walk. Florence by the electric light is beautiful. Last week we had a glorious moon, and the mixture of the lights on the old buildings under a deep blue sky was most beautiful." So you can see from this again, De Morgan really being immersed in her surroundings, taking in visual elements that she would later sort of translate into artworks in order to communicate those feelings to us. And when I look at this painting, even though the reflection has been put on skin rather than buildings, actually the texture of that skin is very similar to sort of a fresco wall or a plaster. And she's used quite a dry paint in creating that painting, which again gives it almost a feeling like that. And to my mind, that absolutely recalls the passage where she talks about the electric light mixed with the moonlight under a deep blue sky. And that colour palette of very intense, almost artificial light that sort of comes out green and yellow against that dark blue are colours that she really did start to experiment in the later years of her life. And I think there's definitely something in it that the atmosphere and the light around her that she'd seen in Florence absolutely was a later influence. Indeed, when the De Morgans travelled to Italy, they did so by ship. And as they were travelling through Spain, and again, a letter to Emily Russell Barrington from Evelyn de Morgan, she writes, "The colour of the sea, the flying fish, the dolphins, the sunsets, etc., say nothing of the coast of Spain and the phosphorescence at night. So if you've ever been lucky enough to be on a beach and see phosphorescence at night, if you disturb the sand or the water, which has phosphorescence in, it literally glows like a glow stick or a glow worm. And again, these paintings really replicate those colours. So it's only through travelling to Italy and immersing herself in these other places that De Morgan's able to take these visual clues and reproduce them in her later artworks. Shall we talk about William? He's been absent until now, but I think that it's really important that it was in Florence that the two De Morgans lived and worked so closely together. And as I said at the start, whilst I can't find any evidence that William ever visited Italy until he did so with Evelyn to her family's home in Florence, he was certainly aware of the Italian Renaissance just as similarly as his wife was, owing to the fact he was a pupil at the Royal Academy for 4 years from 1859 to 1863, and would have been all too well of sculpture, as the first sort of years of the Royal Academy School's education was to teach pupils to draw directly from casts of antique sculpture. And so here we have William's absolutely brilliant astute and almost perfect rendering of Cupid and Psyche after an unidentified Roman sculptor in the collection of the Royal Academy today, that shows the Princess Psyche, who was so beautiful that Venus became jealous, that she sent her son Cupid to make her fall in love with a hideous monster, but instead, of course, Cupid falls in love with Psyche himself. And this marble cast is a brilliant, intimate moment of Cupid sort of desperately falling in love with Psyche, so quite a passionate sculpture with these beautiful entwined arms that gives us almost an hourglass shape in the arrangement of the figures. Again, like I said, it's been brilliantly captured by De Morgan in this sketch. And he would have been aware of the history of that it was a cast taken from the Church of San Balbina on the Aventine Hill in Rome in 1749, and been a Roman version of a late Greek sculpture. So his knowledge and understanding of sort of ancient Italian and Greek culture and mythology was absolute in this. In the 18th century, this group, and particularly this statue, was so admired as this emblem of youthful love that it was often reproduced by companies such as Wedgwood, which, when he became a ceramicist, De Morgan collaborated with. So maybe it was one that he was aware of through that as well. So we do know that the De Morgans definitely both visited Villaniti, and that's owing to a different private collection which has a visitor book for the Villaniti. It's an amazing resource to work your way through and see the volume of guests that were coming through Spencer Stanhope's accommodation and visiting him, but also to look at the specific names in there that were visiting at the same time as other artists, and to start to think about these artists not just in isolation, but in a group of people who were all interested in that Italian arts and culture. And just looking at the page, out of this whole book of names, which the De Morgans mentioned on, you see them here on the right-hand side, about halfway down, November 26, 1893. They've gone to stay at the Villaniti. And a name that's been signed separately and pasted in, which I really like, is that of G.F. Bodley, who was an arts and crafts architect, with whom Evelyn De Morgan and John Rodham Spencer Stanhope had previously collaborated a decade earlier on the creation of the interior of Cawthorne Church in Barnsley, which was next to their both ancestral home, Cannon Hall, where the De Morgan Foundation has a museum today. So perhaps coincidence they were visiting at what looked to be around the same time, but interesting to see the De Morgans, who else was there and who they were visiting whilst they were at the Villaniti. It became a real hub for the arts, and this is an interior scene of the drawing room. The paintings that you can see hanging on the wall are mostly by Spencer Stanhope. Not in this room, but in some of the other rooms and some of the other photographs we have, William Morris wallpaper has been used to cover the walls. Morris was a friend of Spencer Stanhope. So it's just interesting to see, even though it's this beautiful apartment, it's a suite of apartments in Florence, that actually what the Brits have done is bring their own artwork and their own interpretations of Italian art to the interior. William, of course, became John Rodham Spencer Stanhope's relation by marriage to Evelyn, which happened in 1887. And it seems that a lot of the work that William went on to do in Italy was admired by Spencer Stanhope, because here on the mantelpiece we have a William De Morgan plate, which is this one, Chiron and Achilles by William De Morgan. And so this plate sort of celebrates collaboration which De Morgan would have only really entered into on occasion of him having moved to Florence for the winters in the 1890s. And this was very much done for the same reason Spencer Stanhope had been advised to do, on account of his health. William had problems with his lower back and also a family history of tuberculosis, which very sadly killed his sister Alice at the age of 15 and his brother George at the age of 23. And I think, being sort of really quite worried about contracting the disease himself, the De Morgans decided to escape the London winters and move to Florence. Around this time, De Morgan still very much had his own ceramics business, which was held back in London. He'd taken a business partner in the late 1880s, an architect called Halsey Ricardo, and the two of them would communicate by letter and sending designs backwards and forwards between Florence and London. But I think De Morgan really missed having that hands-on influence and involvement in the ceramics business. And so he took on a number of Italian decorators and painters in order that he could oversee some sort of creative output. But he also, during this time, collaborated with a Florentine potter called Ulysses Cantagalli, and it's from this collaboration that this plate comes. So what we have is an earthenware charger with a decoration in lustre and also in a tin glaze to give us the colour. The lustre is the sort of iridescent surface that you see in the red and gold decoration around the edge. So Kieran was the son of Titan Kronos, according to the Greek mythology, and Kronos disguised himself in a horse in order to, of course, seduce Dilara without his wife Rhea discovering the affair. But Kieran was amongst the gentlest, wisest, and most learned of creatures, and as a result was asked to tutor several of the great Greek heroes, including Achilles, who we see riding on his back as he was a centaur. So this wonderful imagery from Greek mythology arranged across the plate by De Morgan. His figurative work had sort of been very dear to him in his Chelsea period, which ended in the early 1880s, but had come back out again through this collaboration with Cantagalli. So the arrangement of the figures, that sort of strong upper body, very much leans on that classical work he was doing, first of all as a student. But I'm sure being in Italy and with his wife painting in a studio, he was sharing that Renaissance aesthetic really came back into De Morgan's pieces. So Cantagalli wasn't the only potter working in Florence at the time De Morgan was there. So why was that a sensible collaboration? Well, when we look at some Cantagalli pieces that he was making anyway, we see that a lot of his references and a lot of his influences were the same as De Morgan. So here we have a Cantagalli vase, which is in the Viennese collection, and it has this wonderful heraldic lion on it that's decorated with sort of medieval motifs. But then at the top here, we have something that's clearly borrowed from Iznik pottery with this wonderful motif here. And these are all motifs that very much see on De Morgan creations and in De Morgan designs. And so I think, in fact, they were both using the same source material, probably drew the two potters together into their collaboration. So Cantagalli was more interested in creating three-dimensional forms than De Morgan was, certainly. And it's in this period that we get some of De Morgan's most sort of exciting and elaborately modelled vases and plates, which you can particularly see in this wonderful cherub vase, which is in the De Morgan collection, currently on display at the Ashmolean Museum through our partnership with them. But all of this moulding of these brilliant snakes in these snake handles and in the grotesque, which are at the bottom of the vase and on the side, would very much have been made by Cantagalli, whereas we see this formal arrangement, again, sort of almost like a fleur-de-lis that we saw in the Cantagalli vase just before, and the lustre glazing are very true to De Morgan. So I just think that was a brilliant collaboration, and I think what an amazing thing to sort of come by chance from the fact that De Morgan had started living in Florence and I think was desperate to have that connection still with the pottery. We do have these really stunning pieces that I don't think De Morgan would have got to of his own accord. I've already mentioned De Morgan wanting to be sort of really keeping his his eye in on what was going on in London, even though he couldn't be there in person. And it was through sending these tile papers back to London that De Morgan managed to sort of keep his place, I suppose, as the kind of creative director of De Morgan & Co. back in London. What we're looking at is a design by William De Morgan on a sheet of very thin tracing paper. It's now in the collection of Witwick Manor in Wolverhampton, the National Trust property. It was previously owned by Geoffrey and Rosalie Mander, who had a great wealth made from the paint manufacturing business. And with it, they chose to buy things like artists' sketchbooks, letters and biographies. So they were more interested in creative process and lifestyles of the artists rather than collecting finished paintings and pieces. So even though they have a modest collection of paintings and some ceramics and decorative arts, it's really this sort of thing which is quite unique to that Wittig Manor collection. It's probably one that was posted from Italy back to London. As we know, De Morgan had these 2 or 3 Italian painters, and what he would do is get them to sketch out his designs. He'd quite often get them to then paint the glaze directly onto the tile paper like this, and it would be those painted papers that would be posted at some 50 a day, according to, again, Emily Russell Barrington, who was a friend of the De Morgans who went out to visit them once. So 50 a day of these tile papers posted back to London, and what the studio in London would then do is simply paint that with a clear glaze and put it in the kiln, and the heat of the kiln would melt or burn away the paper, leaving just the design on the surface of the tile. So it's a very innovative way that De Morgan came up with in order to make sure he would still have creative control over the potteries in London from his position in Italy. So really there was quite a big De Morgan centre in Italy, even though the ceramics themselves weren't actually being produced there. Lots of the designs were throughout that 1890s period. So just really, I think, interesting way to look at De Morgan and what he was making. Florence, I think, became a really special place for the De Morgans, and that's particularly clear for me to see through this painting from 1894 of William De Morgan by his wife Evelyn, painted in his artist's robe against a tiled wall, probably of tiles of his own creation. She's even inscribed that as being painted in Florence, which you could just see in the top right-hand corner there. I think this really speaks to their partnership at the time, and the fact that she made a portrait, which were very rare things for her to do. We only know of 7 or so portraits that she ever made throughout her career. She clearly wanted to capture something of their artistry in Florence, which is why I think he's in his artist's smock, and also of their life there together. It's a really kind of intense portrait. There's not a lot of distraction going on in it. You know, we know that William's an artist, and we get a sense of his creativity from his clothing. But actually, the main thing that we're met with is this very intense and direct stare, which doesn't speak to any of the elements of the drawing and painting that I've sort of illustrated that she was interested in during this period. So poses from figures, that's all gone. It's just a face, which is the main thing that we have. Many Renaissance portraits that she would have copied would have been created in profile, which isn't the case here. He's looking at as directly. So whether this was made just for the couple themselves or as a gift to William as a reminder of their time in Florence, it's quite interesting that it feels quite different to some of those very Renaissance paintings that she made, and probably was something of a more intimate painting, and this kind of capturing of the time spent together that she was maybe more interested in painting this picture. And it was obviously something quite special by virtue of it being a portrait. So that's where we'll end this talk today on the De Morgan's life and work in Italy. Please do use the chat box if you've got any questions, but if not, then we can leave it there. Thank you very much.